So thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, that's basically what this is. What I'm looking at. It's different explanation types that I've seen in Exhibitionists. So I'm just going to try to play a quick clip for you guys. Hopefully this works. QuickTime not available. Okay.
If you click on the little arrow, it might play. Is it only QuickTime?
It was an MP4, but
It might work. It might open something else. Just open Microsoft.
yeah, no, all good.
It doesn't just take it up.
Well, it's honestly not the biggest deal. It was basically just a scene from Horrible Bosses where one of the guys is talking about how he has a offense for being a sexual offender by exposing in a public park, and he's just listing off a couple different explanations. And it was actually kind of hilarious because I actually saw some of that when I was doing my research. So, anyway, let's get to it. So the reason I was mostly interested in this, it wasn't specifically exhibitionists, they were just my sample. It was looking at different types of explanations and primarily denial. Now, most offenders actually will exhibit some form of partial denial or absolute denial. In most cases, it's actually just partial or rationalizations to minimize their behavior. Now, the problem with this is many sex offenders are actually considered unqualified for treatment or relapse prevention treatment because they're exhibiting some form of denial. And that's really problematic because we're not treating offenders, and then therefore once they're done their probation or whatever it is that they got, we're releasing them back in public, hoping that they won't reoffend. But without certain treatment strategies, then how can we guarantee that they won't reoffend? Now, the biggest issue with this is denial isn't actually really described properly. It's considered more of like a binary concept. Either the offender is in denial or not in denial. So it's like, I did it or I didn't do it. But in reality, it's much more multifaceted than that. And there's so many different areas where the offender will either minimize their behavior, they'll have rationalizations for their behavior, they will fully admit, which is great, but that's very rare. We're never really going to see that. So when you see any kind of minimization or rationalization, and the interviewing therapist considers that denial, and we're not getting that person proper treatment, that's not good. So what I was focused on was cognitive distortions, which are basically rationalizations is the best way to put it for like someone to minimize their behavior. Now, the thing with cognitive distortions is it is actually a common reasonable defense strategy. If you guys could just think about any single time in your life where you knew you did something wrong, and most offenders know they did something wrong, and it could be something really simple, and you get accused of it, are you just gonna be like, yeah, I did it? No. Most people will be like, well, like I was really stressed out, or I was drunk, or I'm having a lot of problems with my girlfriend, boyfriend, what else? Like, try to think of things where you guys have actually minimized your behavior, because guess what? None of us like knowing that we did something wrong. And that's no difference for sex offenders. Now, before I go further, because I always get into some arguments with people, and they're always like, are you comparing me to a sex offender? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no. We're just comparing that idea that when you do something wrong, in most circumstances, you don't want to just fully admit that behavior. Awesome if you do, but very few people do that. So, for example, the victim didn't suffer, was not harmed as a result of the offense. This could be misconstrued as denial, and then this person might actually not get treatment. But this is actually more of a cognitive distortion, because where in this is this person saying they didn't actually do the crime? This isn't saying that they didn't do the crime. The guy is actually, no, I did it, but the person wasn't that harmed. Like, it was okay. They weren't offended by my exhibitionist behavior, my flashing behavior. They liked my penis. It was awesome. So they are admitting to their behavior. They're just having some form of rationalization for that behavior. So this isn't denial, and that's the biggest problem. Denial, the research in denial right now is still fairly limited. And I think it was just really up until like 2005, more researchers are now more interested in denial and the different levels of denial, because it is a spectrum. It's absolute all the way to, like from absolute from partial to that full admittance behavior. So where are we? So yeah, it is a normal social response from everyone. So exhibitionism, flashers. I decided to do something a little bit more tame because, you know, again, sex offenders is a very sensitive subject to study, and I had to read a lot of case files, and it was originally pedophilia, but I really just didn't want to go there. So the reason I chose exhibitionism as well is because research is really rare. It is actually one of the most common sexual offenses. So actually when you guys hear there's a high rate of sex offenses in the neighborhood, it's usually not rape or sexual assault. In most cases, it's indecent exposure. It is because it's such a huge frequent offense. It's interesting because the research is rare, and the reason people think it's rare because it's like, oh, they didn't really do anything, because in most cases they didn't actually come in contact with their victims. So it's considered a social nuisance, but in reality, they actually do have a high rate of reoffense, and in many cases they have actually come in contact for previous offenses. It doesn't have to be sexual in nature, but they do have criminal records. So yes, because of their dangerous incapacity to control their impulses, I thought, might as well, let's look into this. So I looked at 50 closed, open, and forensic files from the Forensic Assessment Community Services Unit in downtown Edmonton. And this ranged from offenses from 1992 to 2012. This is the mean age of my offenders. And I developed a 63-item coding form, which basically just looked at their demographic information, the index offense variables, so whether they were sexually motivated, if they wanted to do it for shock reaction, criminal history variables, and the explanation types, which is what I was mostly focused on. And this is just an example of what it was. This is my coding form. So basically what I would do is I would be reading each file and then go down the coding form, and then if the item was present, yes. If the item wasn't present, no. And if I didn't have enough information, I would just have to leave it blank, which was unfortunate. So my explanation types were based on different items. I had the acknowledgement of the offense, absolute denial, which was just one item, and then I also split up a couple explanations into 5 and 4 items. So there was a pool basically of explanations that represented partial denial or cognitive distortions, which I was primarily interested in, and admittance type behaviors that would actually reflect the pure motives, and I wasn't really expecting too many individuals to present that. So basically, I organized it like this. I've got partial denial and cognitive distortions on one end, admittance type representing their pure motives. So basically, minimization of sexual deviance. No, I wasn't aroused at the time. Or minimization of responsibility. I did it, but like, it wasn't really my fault because, you know, I didn't realize what I was doing or something like that. Externalizing excuses is the most common one. We like to blame our spouses, like incessant nagging, or I was drunk. We like to blame it on some form of external variable that caused us to do that. Accidental, I didn't know my penis was hanging out. That has been used, pretty hilarious. Privacy excuse, I did it in my home, so I didn't know someone could see me. Very common explanations that I found, so that's why I organized it that way. And then sexual pursuits and sexual satisfaction. This is actually them admitting to their behavior and really emphasizing that motive. Basically, so sexual pursuits is they actually wanted to engage in some form of sexual contact with their victim. Sexual satisfaction was like, I did it because I just really wanted to. Internalizing excuse, I did it because I wanted to. That's the scariest one. And very few people actually admitted to that. And impulsive, I'll just give you guys actually my results here. Impulsive, I did it because I was bored. And if you guys just look, you can see that there's actually a much more higher frequency of explanations reflecting cognitive distortions versus explanations reflecting those pure motives. And the problem is some of these offenders didn't get treatment. Because even though they're admitting to that behavior, there's some form of denial, so it's like, well, they're probably not suitable for treatment. And that is the biggest issue. even though, again, right here, 98% of my offenders did acknowledge the crime. So, and actually, and the one exception was that the one person who didn't acknowledge the crime was just severely mentally delayed and didn't realize at all what they were doing. I actually didn't even really want to include them in the sample, but I wanted my 50. So I'm just letting you guys know that now. Now, the limitations in my study is that it was a descriptive study. I would like to go forward with this and then actually start using inferential statistics to actually see the two different types of explanations and then comparing it with how they would do in treatment if possible. I only used the 9 explanations, which I just basically developed as the most common ones, but there were a couple that came up that I couldn't even really include because that wasn't part of my coding form. And again, the denial construct is still very limited, but that's the point of this research, is we want to know more about denial because, well, we don't want to keep putting sex offenders back into public, and even if it is considered a nuisance behavior, they can still potentially do something worse. This is the first study of its kind to look at explanations primarily in exhibitionists. And basically, if we do more research on this, then we could potentially actually use different types of explanations to help in treatment strategies. It's like, here's a person who's using a lot of externalizing explanations. Well, how about we put them in some form of like cognitive behavioral therapy to let them know that it's okay that you're doing this, but let's try to convince you that this is why your behavior is wrong. And it presents some foundational work because it was the first of its kind. I just want to let you guys, leave you with this little take-home note that I really liked. They highlight the idea that minimizations and rationalizations enjoy an awkward position of being universally condemned while being universally used. And again, none of you are sex offenders. We all do stupid stuff. I'm not trying to compare you to sex offenders because this is always a really sensitive topic for a lot of people. But at the same time, we do also externalize, and we also create rationalizations for the behavior that we do that's wrong. And I'm not defending sex offense behavior, but I am defending the fact that these people do deserve treatment, and we want them to stop. So, special thanks to Dr. Sandy Jung, because without her guidance, I would have been completely lost in this, and the staff at the Forensic Assessment and Community Services Outpatient Unit. They really helped me find a lot of files on this. It would have been very difficult without them. Questions? Sorry I took too long.